lecture, the title, here we go. The title of my lecture is Internet of Nature. And I'll just quickly introduce myself before we get into what that is. So I'm an ecological engineer. And for those of you that aren't familiar with that term, it's a relatively new discipline. It was established, the early beginnings of it about 60 years ago, but it really didn't start to come into fruition until about 30 years ago, thanks to the work of a couple of different scientists led by one in particular, Professor William Mitch. And essentially what ecological engineering is the name already kind of gives it away. It combines ecology and engineering, essentially to design, build, and maintain and reimagine ecosystems for the benefit of both humans and nature. And really at the core of ecological engineering is designing these spaces so that we don't have to choose between one or the other. That was what I did my PhD in. Before that, my background was in evolutionary biology and ecology. And I did my master's in earth sciences. Did my bachelor's in Toronto, which is where I grew up, just outside of Toronto. I did my master's in Amsterdam because I'm Dutch originally, and even though I spent my entire life in Canada, I had Dutch parents, so I was always very curious about what life would be like in the Netherlands. So Amsterdam has been more or less home base for the past 8 years. And while I was doing my PhD, I got the opportunity to spend time at the MIT Sensible City Lab, which now has opened up its own chapter in Amsterdam as well. I got the opportunity to do my PhD fieldwork and lab work there under a Fulbright scholarship, which was one of the best experiences that I could have had during my PhD. It was incredible to be able to be with some of the leading minds when it comes to using technology in the urban space. That led to doing a postdoc with Connecting Nature, which is also the project that funded my PhD. And that postdoc ended about a year ago in June of 2021. And since that year, I had the opportunity to keep going in academia and following that path. And that might still be in my future, but I felt like a year ago, and I still feel like now was the time to really put all of my eggs into this Internet of Nature basket and see what it could become. So since that time, I've started a podcast. I've been doing a ton of speaking, keynote speaking, teaching, developing courses, educational materials, and doing consultancy when it comes to the idea of the Internet of Nature, which we will get into now. So as I mentioned just briefly, I grew up on what I think is really this border between city and nature, which inspired a lot of my early thinking. I grew up in a typical North American suburb, not far from Toronto in southwestern Ontario in Canada. And this image was taken not far from the neighborhood that I grew up in. And I think this image represents so well a lot of the questions that I had growing up there, which was, why is it that humans are over here and nature is over there? But yet as humans, we still value nature so much that we go in and you see it with the little seedlings and plants that we've put here on the left side of the image. We still value it so much that we're still going to put that nature in, but we don't want to, I always felt like this style of urban sprawl and the suburban development was so counterintuitive to a lot of the things that we valued as humans. And it brought up a lot of questions in terms of why do we make the decisions to build cities in this way? Could there possibly be a better way to have, be in more harmony between humans and nature? And ultimately, it's what inspired me to want to pursue ecological engineering and really develop better places for both people and nature to live. Now, being based in Amsterdam over the last 8 years, that is a city that takes its greenery very, very seriously. In fact, for some of you, a little bit of tree history. When we think about Amsterdam, we typically think about a whole lot of different things. Most of us don't think about trees. We think of, well, I'll let you run your imagination wild in terms of what you think of when you think of Amsterdam, but I guarantee most of you are not thinking about its trees. But in fact, Amsterdam has a very long and well thought out tree history, if you will. There's evidence pointing that the first trees were actually planted in 1340. initially, really, as they were developing some of the early canal belts, they were really used in order to stabilize the soil, which is why certain tree species were chosen over others. They were also planted because even in 1340, Amsterdam realized that citizens realized that trees were incredibly helpful to have to provide shade for marketplaces, but also the cows and the horses and other animals that used to, be in the streets of Amsterdam, they would actually feed on a lot of the leaves as well. So it was kind of this this agricultural urban mix at the very beginning, and trees played an important role in that. There's even evidence pointing that in 1454, in the Rule Book of Amsterdam, there was actually written that if you damaged a tree, you would either get a fine or your right hand chopped off. So when I say that Amsterdam is a city that takes its greenery very seriously, I mean it. This kind of rules and regulation were further developed really during the Golden Age, when, of course, the Canal Belt was rapidly developing. They made rules then that said any parcel that you had in the inner Canal Belt of Amsterdam, at least 50% had to be a garden. And that kind of forward thinking, although they may not have considered it forward thinking at the time, that really is what we have much of Amsterdam's incredibly dense urban core to thank. As you can see here in the picture listed, almost this 50-50 balance between development, built development, and gardens. Of course, that ratio has been very difficult to protect over recent years, but nonetheless was that written into law in 1613. And now in 2022, there are some 300,000 trees in the maintenance of the city of Amsterdam, and there's a total of 1 million trees in Amsterdam. So actually more trees than people that live in Amsterdam. Now, I always saw, and that was one of the main reasons why I wanted to move back to the Netherlands, is not only for personal reasons to explore my Dutch roots, but also because I saw Netherlands as a massive source of inspiration for nature inclusive building. So many different examples are really coming out of the Netherlands, whether that's bricks that have been designed to offer different kinds of species of birds nesting areas, whether that's things like built-in worm hotels, whether that's on a bigger level, urban development plans that really have nature at the core of its plan, that really have a nature first approach. And that's something that has been really rapidly developed and now is almost seen as a Dutch export product. Many have seen this as our cycling culture. There are many delegations from all over the world that visit Amsterdam and the Netherlands to be able to learn from that. The same could be said about nature inclusive building. But the same could also be said when it comes to the smart city. The Netherlands has really led the way when it comes to all different kinds of applications of smart city applications, whether that's things like the big belly sensors, garbage bins that help really understand where and when you need to empty certain garbage bins, through solar lit up different cycling paths, whether that's through concepts like the green light, which is that if you operate at a speed, I think it's 16 kilometers an hour, you know that you're going to hit a green light, not only for vehicles, but also as a cyclist. And even though that we had so many different examples, both of the nature inclusive movement and the smart cities of the future, I felt like we were missing something. And this question really is what inspired me to want to do my PhD in this field. And that was that when you Google the smart city, this is one of the most common images that you come up with, the so-called smart city components, which shows the use of different technologies to support both civic processes, but also improve quality of life. We're using technologies in all of these different facets. And I felt like we were missing this one core thing. You know, we've opened up to being able to use technologies in the area of government and manufacturing and health and voting, even our energy and our mobility in cities, but we're still missing something critical, and that is the ecology of our cities. And I felt like this was a trend that was not only in our cities, but something that, really globally that we were feeling. This idea that, and this meme represents it so well, but that technology and nature become polar opposites of one another. And if you think about it, every single sector has undergone some form of digital transformation. The way that we vote, the way that we date, the way that we organize ourselves, the way that we move around our cities and our environments, the way that we order our groceries, every single sector has undergone some form of digital transformation for good and bad. But nature has long been left behind from that. And I felt like having nature be left alone, having nature not undergo its own form of digital transformation is stifling progress, both in technology and in nature itself. Ultimately, I felt like we needed to bridge this gap between nature and technology, and especially in cities, because the nature in cities is of that much more of a crucial importance when it comes to the fact that this is where the majority of human population is really gathered and will continue to be gathered, especially when we look at the trends that are happening in developing nations all around the world. And I felt like the only way to bridge that gap between nature and technology was to bring the two together. And that's what led to the conceptualization of the Internet of Nature. And the Internet of Nature is my concept for bridging technology and ecology together within the urban environment. And I've spent the last 5 years now really uncovering what are some of the most exciting examples within the Internet of Nature, which one of them have a business case, which ones don't, which ones do we need more research in, which ones do we know a lot about. It's about bringing them into practice. I've really tried to approach the Internet of Nature from all different kinds of hats, really, whether that's been through empirical research, whether that's been through developing case studies, whether that's been finding investment for Internet of Nature companies, whether that's been raising capital, whether that's been speaking about it, sharing these stories. There's been a ton of these different examples, and it's really what I want to spend the rest of the time that we have together today, is to really dive into some of the most exciting examples that I've seen, and hopefully leave a lot of time after the lecture to dig into some of these examples even more. What I want to start with is this idea that if we want to grow healthy urban environments, we need to be very aware of one of the most undervalued resources that we have in our urban environments, which is soil. The fact of the matter is, we are not going to be able to meet these very ambitious, huge tree planting targets and ambitions if we don't take better care of the soil in our cities. There are estimates that about 80% on average in the major cities around the world, that upwards of 80% of that soil has been polluted in some way, meaning that any kind of urban vegetation is under extreme stress when it comes to being able to survive and thrive in an urban environment where we need these trees desperately. Now, one of the things that I think can help is once you've basically ensured that the soil health is good. There's this old saying in arboriculture in urban forestry, which is that you should plant a $5 tree in a $50 hole. And I think that's something that's really critical to keep in mind. So first and foremost is we need to improve soil quality in our cities. But after that, the number one reason why trees don't make it in their first year is because of a lack of watering or too much watering. And the fact of the matter is that most of this watering happens on kind of a gut feeling approach based on the type of species that you've planted. You know more or less, okay, that species should get this much amount of water in every 3 weeks or so I'll drive by and give it water then. That kind of logic just doesn't hold up anymore in the cities of today. Cities that are getting hotter and drier, cities that are having almost torrentially tropical seeming rainstorms that have a lot of water at one time and then none for prolonged periods of time. Cities and weather patterns are changing, meaning that that old kind of gut feeling just doesn't hold up anymore. And we need more of a data-driven real-time approach to be able to understand what trees need water when. Soil moisture sensors and soil sensors in general are one of the technologies that can help us deal with this. Essentially, without getting into the really kind of the details, the dirty details of these soil sensors, essentially what happens is they can measure a multitude of different things. So I've been working with a company called Soilmania, which develops sensors which essentially are able to measure the pH of the soil, the oxygen levels, the organic matter, the amount of nutrients, and the salinity and the moisture. And I want to hone into that last one for a second, because in the Netherlands, and this is something that's echoed in other countries around the world, typically 15 to 20% of newly planted trees don't make it in their first year. And this is something that we need to desperately change, because we're also running out of trees to plant in cities. So the fact that we're losing nearly a fifth of them every single year that they're planted is, in my view, absolutely unacceptable. And being able to understand where and when we need to water trees is having an effect. In fact, in this one case study in Maastricht, in the south of the Netherlands, there we planted 1,000 lemon trees on top of a tunnel, on top of a car tunnel. And these trees are essentially planted in a shoebox, a metal shoebox that's about 2 meters deep. So these trees never have the opportunity to be able to access their own groundwater, meaning that they need extra monitoring. And the more that we do these kinds of unnatural rewilding projects, the more monitoring they're going to need to be able to survive. For this project of 1,000 trees, we used just 3 soil moisture sensors. And those 3 soil moisture sensors have ensured that now 5 years later after planting, we've only lost 1 tree on top of this tunnel, which is incredibly high success rate. And it's something that we've been able to replicate in other sites across the Benelux and now in the UK as well. The nice thing to remember about soil sensors as well is that the idea here is not to have a sensor per tree. In fact, as you just noticed, I said 1,000 trees and only 3 soil moisture sensors. So you constantly want to make a calculation here. What is the minimum amount of technology that we can get away with to have the most amount of environmental impact? And that is something that I really want you to keep in the back of your minds. And hopefully that's something we can get into during the discussion as well. The nice thing about these sensors is that this information in terms of when and where to water doesn't just have to go to the tree care managers, it can actually go to the citizens as well. So this is a way to actually get citizens involved. This is a project that we did in a small city called, a small town really, called Gijsteren, where we had, instead of these tree watering alerts to go to the tree care managers, they actually went to the surrounding citizens. So they would actually be responsible for watering the tree at the right time. And I think it would be incredible if we were able to scale something like this up. But as I alluded to earlier, we've been working on this for the past 5-6 years now. What that means is that we have an incredible amount of data at our disposal. Data about matching when certain weather patterns happened and when certain trees were watered and how those trees did. That amount of data is now helping us develop essentially a prediction algorithm, which is going to show us not only that, okay, this sensor says that this tree needs water now, but it's going to help us develop predictions to ensure that tree care watering managers don't only have the information that day, but can actually plan their entire week ahead, so that we know that certain trees will need water based on all of this data, based on soil information, weather data, climate change information, be able to determine that these trees will need this amount of water in 72 hours. And that kind of information, it may seem trivial to you, but that's exactly the kind of information that's going to turn the tree care sector, something that's an incredibly reactive sector, to one that is very proactive, which is ultimately going to mean that we are going to have healthy and happy vegetation that's going to be there for generations and not just seasons. But that's an example I'd love to get a little bit more into later. One of the other ways that we're scaling this up in terms of making this more accessible to the public is actually using not only soil sensors, but also tree sensors, and attaching them to a tree, in this case, a tree named Bowie the birch, which you can follow on Twitter, and have that sensor information actually be translated into tweets that we've done the copywriting for, but we've essentially programmed an entire rule-based algorithm. Essentially, when the sensors say soil moisture is at this percentage and relative humidity is at this percentage, we want Bowie to say this. And it'll take that from a bucket of different tweets that we've pre-written, and it'll automatically tweet. So this tweeting tree kit, it's not the world's first tweeting tree, but it's the world's first sensors to tweets kit that we're launching this summer through Bowie the birch as well, which is an incredibly exciting project that hopefully, I hope is going to do a lot more to raise citizen awareness when it comes to the trials and tribulations that urban vegetation struggles with, so that we can learn to take better care of our urban trees, because we, again, desperately need them. Now, I'm going to skip over 2 examples because I'm going to run out of time, and I want to get into this last one. But just quickly, this is a really cool example from the MIT Sensible City Lab that uses Google Street View and a computer vision algorithm essentially to objectively quantify street level greenery, which has a number of different use cases. So I want to get into the discussion if we can. And this is an example using LiDAR that's trying to do a similar thing. The last example that I want to make sure I have time for is this idea that we've come now to the point where I think intuitively many of us knew that nature is good for us, right? When we go outside for a 5-minute walk even, or when we go for a hike, or when we go rock climbing, or go for a swim in a lake, or we have a couple of days off and we go to a national park, we know intuitively that that feels good for us. It's good for our mind, our body, our soul. There's incredibly this quote that says, I believe in God, only I spell it Nature. This incredible quote that I think really encompasses this idea that nature is not only something that's good for us on a mental and an emotional and on a physical level, but that nature for many of us, especially in the very secular world that we live in now, that nature has become somewhat of a religion for many people, that it's become spiritual, and it's incredibly important to protect these places, not only outside of our cities, but within them as well. All of that to say is that this idea that nature is medicine has gotten the attention of doctors and medical practitioners around the world, so much so that they're now actually prescribing nature to their patients. These kinds of programs have taken us across the Netherlands. There's a program called Natural Precept, Nature on Prescription. There's Parks prescriptions taken off in the US, in the UK. Glasgow has an incredible program around it. Canada's, which has a single payer governmental healthcare system, is now actually subsidizing national park passes. So this is something that's really taken off around the world. But the question is, if nature is medicine, and if we're going to start looking at nature as a public health intervention, we need to start coming up with an objective way to measure the nature around us. And that's exactly what I've been working on with a company called Nature Quant, based out of Oregon. What Nature Quant does is it takes a number of these different technologies that we've been able to touch on just briefly today, whether that's computer vision, satellite imagery, different pollution indexes, Google Street View. All of these different data sets have been compiled to be able to come up with a weighted score of what is the quality of the natural elements for any static location. And we've done this scoring across the US, and we're doing it now for Canada and Europe as well. And if we know how well nature scores around us, that kind of data is incredibly important when it comes at looking about, well, how equal is that spread of nature? How can we ensure that areas where nature perhaps isn't scoring as well, where can we improve it? What does that look like from a healthcare perspective, from a real estate perspective? What does that look like for demography researchers? And if we know how well the nature scores around us, then theoretically, we could also track how and when we move through that nature score landscape, that perhaps we might even be able to calculate the optimal dose of nature. This is an app called Nature Dose that we've built on top of Nature Score. And what Nature Dose does is it tracks using your GPS location where you've been in your surroundings. And essentially it aggregates your time, your minutes that you've spent inside, your minutes you've spent outside, and your minutes that you've been exposed to nature. Now this is interesting as just like a personal tool to be able to get your nudge and say, oh, I haven't hit my nature dose for today. Let me get outside and fix that, in the same way that a step counter might have done that in the past. But I encourage you, in fact, I really want to encourage you here to think a little bit further of what this technology could take us. If we have nature score that proves to us that certain neighborhoods have less nature than others, that now it becomes a matter of life or death from your doctor is getting involved in terms of why you have certain nature, why a certain person might have a higher nature dose than the other. then if we're starting to use nature dose as a public health intervention, then that completely changes the game in terms of the business case for nature. It used to be that the municipality was the only one that was responsible for ensuring that people had parks to be able to access it. But that business model is clearly not working. Time and time again, we're seeing that urban forestry departments and parks and recreation departments are underfunded. So it's time that we took a little bit of a different approach to how we might be able to fund nature. In fact, I believe we should start mainstreaming nature. Imagine if we got companies like Virgin Pulse or Thrive Global or Paceline involved. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of who these companies are. So Thrive Global was founded by Ariana Huffington as a way to combat burnout culture. What if Thrive Global encouraged all of its millions and millions of users to encourage its employees, the same like Virgin Pulse might be able to do, encourage its employees to get outside and get their nature dose. In the same way, Paceline, you can actually get rewards already based on your steps and your heart rate and your healthy habits. How many times you've meditated per day, for example, how many steps that you've taken. What if you could get points and even financial rewards for the amount of nature that you've been exposed to per day? What would a society look like that is able to reward and stimulate access to nature in this way? And I know it might seem a little bit counterintuitive, like, do I really need my employer or I do really need cash back from my credit card to encourage me to get outside? Maybe that's what it's going to need to take to facilitate that interaction to a more nature-rich community. It could be something to think about. This idea that if, for example, the fourth ring on the Apple Watch was not just how many calories that you've burned or the amount of exercise that you had that day, but actually the amount of nature that you've been exposed to. What if we could mainstream nature and not only have us be focused about how many steps we take per day, but in fact where we take those steps? What would society look like what would a society look like that really encourages nature, not only as something that we do on the weekends or when we get some days off, but really encourage it to be a daily practice? I hope these are some of the questions that we can get into in the discussion. If I've inspired you to check out any of these other examples, I come out with a podcast every single Wednesday, the Internet of Nature podcast, which delves into the origin stories of many of the innovators behind several of the examples and many more that I've mentioned here today. So I encourage you to check that out. And I hope we can embark on an interesting discussion because there's a lot to cover on that.
Thanks a lot. Thank you very much, Nadina, for this super fascinating presentation, for this inspiring conclusion also. So if you have any questions you would like to ask, feel free to virtually raise your hand as usual. Yes, Maxime.
Hi, Nadina. Thanks a lot.
Sorry, just one thing, Maxime. Don't forget to quickly introduce yourself to Nadina before asking your question.
Thanks for the reminder. I'm Maxime. I am a strategic designer based in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam, actually. But I'm Belgian, so I'm not really from here. I have a question for you regarding, like, it's a really high level conversation, but I think it's a very interesting one. It's based on this like philosophical talk from Timothy Morton about othering. So basically it's like nature. What is nature? Is it us? Is it not us? And therefore, is it there to support us as human in our activities? And then if I'm taking the last example that you showed, there's a bit of this like tokening of the fact that you value nature in your own activity rather than nature with its own benefits. And I understand that in the current system, you do not have any valuations whatsoever of all the externalities that it provides. So I understand this exercise of basically internalizing those externalities, which I think is important because now it's just not done. It's on cost, there's no benefits. But then there's this question of like, how far should we push it in terms of, look, nature is helping us saving money here. Like, it's a very broad question here, but it's more like, should we measure nature? And if so, what do we measure that is meaningful for us?
Yeah, Maxime, it's a great question. I think it touches on what I started the lecture with, this idea that every sector has undergone some form of digital transformation, but we've kind of left nature untouched. And I think for a lot of ways that stems from this idea that we want nature, and whatever that may be, and everyone here in this room is going to have a different definition of what nature means to them. For some people, that's Yosemite National Park. For other people, it's a houseplant. For other people, it's just stepping onto their balcony and feeling the air on their face and taking a deep breath. So for everyone is going to have a different definition, and it's not up to me to decide what that is. Although many academics have tried, and some of them have succeeded for the measurement of whatever they needed to measure in that study, but it's a much more difficult, complex question than that. In terms of why we need to measure it and what we need to measure it for, I think that's the interesting thing that we're doing with Nature Quant, is that I think in the past, a lot of measurements of nature have been based around carbon and CO2. How much carbon can this plot of land sequester? How much tree can this how much CO2 can this tree sequester? And I've been, and there's a couple of podcast episodes about this, but I've been a pretty fervent opponent of that, because I always think it's about what are you optimizing for? And if you're optimizing for CO2, then where does that end? Because if we operate under the assumption that any increase in CO2 is a bad one, then by virtue of following that argument to its end, that means that every breath that we take is a bad one. That ultimately that would mean that all humans essentially should vanish off of our planet. And I think when you optimize for something like human health, I think when you optimize for human health, whether that's through our exposure to nature, whether that's through our agricultural system, whether that's through our mobility systems, I think when you optimize for human health, you get pretty damn close in terms of optimizing for planetary health. So I think that's what, because I've been thinking about this a lot over the last several years, and especially over the last several months. I think that's what I'm gearing towards today, is optimizing for human health. But I think it's under constant scrutiny, and I don't think we'll ever quite get it. But I do think that if we were to say, okay, hands off, let nature do its thing, I think we're going to lose it under the current system. And I think it's better to work with the tools that we have in our current system and encourage people to use those. To ultimately, it's a system where I hope that the technology that's made it happen will either feel like it's an invisible hand, like it's not even there, or that it'll become obsolete. And I'll leave you with one final thing on that note. I had a really inspiring podcast episode last week that came out with a guy named Tim van Dam, who is a Dutch entrepreneur, started in telecommunications, and then started this organization called Smart Parks, which uses these different sensor networks essentially to protect wildlife in countries around the world, but especially a lot in Africa and in India, focusing on the big five: rhinos, giraffes, elephants, that kind of thing. And I asked him, I was like, where is this all? He's a technologist. He loves his technology, right? And I asked him, where's this all going for you? Where does this end? And he's like, it ends with me, being out of a job. I hope that Smart Parks as an organization, the technology that we're using, I hope we will render it obsolete, because we've gotten so far at protecting these ecosystems that they no longer require our protection. And that's something that I think that the same kind of thinking that I want to have around urban ecology as well, when it comes to putting sensors to helping understand where and when trees need to be watered. I hope that through that technology, we as humans can learn to be better stewards so that we don't need that technology. But I do think we're at a critical point now where technology can be an assist to get us to that place. And that place is for all of us to define what we want that to look like.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Oh, yes.
Hi, thanks a lot for your talk. I'm listening a lot to your podcast, which I found very interesting and insightful. So thanks for this whole science communication. I have 2 questions. So I'm actually doing a PhD. I recently started last year around using technology for measuring biodiversity in cities, and around right now acoustic spectrum. But anyway, so I have two questions. One is about the wilderness of cities. So you show this example of tree in this like metallic cylinder. And where do you see maybe the interaction between wilderness of nature and landscape architect, and how they can maybe come together to not only facilitate human to help nature thrive, but also just having a bit of more like nature taking care of itself. And the other that I would quite like to speak is about the measuring. So you speak about using only 3 sensors for the 1,000 tree. It's a question that is coming a lot in my studies and with other people I'm working with. How many sensors do we need, for example, for monitoring bats? How long do you need this sensor running? Can you have intermittent running and so on? And I wanted to hear about your thought, or maybe the research and the step you take to define the number of sensors you decide to use.
Okay, great questions. Thank you. Let me start with the first one. My theory with this is pretty simple, which is create, make, and keep it as wild as possible. And that as possible is obviously the caveat here, because ideally, the best thing I think to do in terms of rewilding is do nothing, is leave it be. And there's a number of really successful case studies, cities around the world that have done this, and that's been really successful. The problem with that is it doesn't take into account all of the different stakeholders. And for this very specific example of, it was a car tunnel, and then they had the opportunity to build a park on top of it. So the alternative would have been to not do that, to put tarmac or asphalt here and then have nothing, right? Or maybe to have some like light vegetation, some really kind of superficial vegetation. Instead, they opted to make a bit of a showcase there, and they called it the green carpet, actually. And they really wanted to have this be a showcase project of what's possible in this area, which is why they had to come up with this construction of this metal shoebox and put the trees in there. And of course, that was a whole discussion, right? How deep do you make it? And of course, there were people in the room that said 2 meters, are you out of your mind? At least make it 5. And obviously there's different constraints with that. So I think keep it as wild as possible, but if we want to, move towards these nature-rich communities, we're going to, as humans, have to be okay with, I guess, altering our definition of nature. And maybe nature and wilderness are 2 separate things. Maybe, I don't know. But I think at least we need to be a little bit open to broadening that definition a little bit. Otherwise, I don't think that we're going to see progress. And I think anyone who comes in and says, how dare you put trees in a shoebox, I think they're stifling progress, because I think we also need to experiment with these things and see what happens and see if that works. And it's in the same way that, if a weed comes through the sidewalk, I mean, that's nature too. So I think we need to have a broaden, point being, keep it as wild as possible and broaden our definition of what nature could be, would be my answer to that. And your second question about coming up with this calculation, it's very site specific, but to take you through this example, the thing that you want to look for when you're determining that calculation is what are the species of the trees and are they different from each other? What is the soil type like? Different like clay-based soils are going to hold on to water much differently than a loam-based soil would be. Looking into natural precipitation patterns, understanding drainage. So, for example, with the shoebox, it was the same kind of trees. They were all linden trees. It was the same kind of soil because it was all put there manually by humans. And the only thing that same kind of precipitation, obviously, same area. So the only thing that we really needed to account for was drainage. So essentially, if some were higher up than others, then that was obviously going to have a different kind of pattern with precipitation. So we created zones, 3 different zones, and we used 1 sensor per zone. And then if that sensor said, okay, this zone needs water or this tree needs water, we extrapolated that action for the entire zone. And then we would take different actions for the other different zones. And that's kind of the But those zones kind of are differing in size. So for another project, which was in the really the downtown core of a city, it was 16 different trees, and we ended up using actually 10 sensors because each condition was so different. And a lot of that also has to do with the fact that when trees are planted kind of solitary from one another, you create very fend for yourself conditions. The trees are actually quite good at helping each other out, and they actually tend to do this. Is kind of an emerging area of research as well, is looking at this idea of tiny forests in cities, that they actually tend to do quite better than just individual tree pits, which I think the reasons for which are quite common sense. But yeah, those are some of the conditions you should take into account.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
Hello. Yeah, super interesting talk. Yeah, I also have 2 questions. But yeah, a lot of these sensors and such really reminded me also of the Netherlands being kind of a leader in food technology worldwide, and also like the second biggest food producer. And basically, yeah, I'm wondering, I've seen some also work on like vertical gardening, and I'm just wondering, you know, are there overlapping tools for what you use it for and for what the food industry use it for, or what is the difference? Is it different because you're trying to optimize for different goals, or is it different because one happens like with this ecosystems approach and the other one tries to do something within a closed systems approach, like a vertical garden? Like a little bit, I'd like to understand, you know, like what's the overlap there, or also the difference. And then my second question is basically a little bit more playful. So there was this Biosphere 2 project in the 90s in Arizona, right, where they tried to establish a closed, self-sufficient ecosystem. And basically it kind of failed as far as I understood, or there was some issues. And I'm just wondering, with all these like monitoring tools available now, would we be able to achieve their goal yeah, at this time or not, or what is still lagging, and is that something we should strive for anyway? I mean that was for kind of like space travel and colonialization, planet colonialization, the idea of why you would need something like that. But yeah, I would be interested in hearing a little bit about that. And maybe now, as a just instead of the introduction, I'm Tabea, and I'm a PhD in spatial agent-based modeling of urban health interventions at Utrecht University. Yeah, so sorry for the lack of order.
No, that was great, Tabea. Thank you. Although I have to admit, I was getting so excited about the biosphere example that you brought up that I completely have lost your first question.
That was basically about this overlap with the food technology industry, right, which is so giant, yes, in the Netherlands.
Yes. You know, thank you.
Cool.
Yeah, it's back. Right. So I'll answer your first one first. So when I was doing my master's, I did my master's research in a lot to do with agroforestry, actually. So I was doing a lot in the agricultural space as well. And I was fascinated by what I saw there in terms of bringing this agroforestry, this permaculture approach, which is obviously a much more kind of regenerative approach to agriculture, but then using technology, which also felt very, very, counterintuitive to bring the two together. So that's where some of kind of the first inspiration. I was very inspired by the idea of precision agriculture, and they were using sensors obviously in that space, and satellite imagery as well, and big data and AI. So that's definitely where a lot of kind of the early musings of the Internet of Nature started, absolutely. The one thing, of course, and you touch upon it a little bit in your question, that makes it so different is that those technologies have a very clear business case. You invest in the technology, that technology has a certain return on investment, because if you use the technology, well, you can hope that you're going to get this many more yields of this much more higher quality. It's going to sell for this much more. Your profits will go up. Ergo, your technology you'll have a return on your investment in technology. So it's easier to make that business case. And even in precision forestry, which is another sector that's provided a lot of inspiration, you have a similar kind of business case, but then of course it's for the timber and the lumber management sector. So it's all about how can we use technology to make sure that, and also for sustainable forestry, to make sure that we're choosing the right trees of the right size, and then we're going to cut those down instead of other trees that we're not going to take a clear cutting approach. We're going to use a much more nuanced precision approach. So these are incredible developments, but again, when you try to translate that business case to the city, that becomes a lot more difficult. because all of a sudden, where is your return on investment? Because you're not in the market about, using those crops or cutting down that tree for paper or wood or whatever have you. You're in the market of keeping that, let's take trees, for example, keeping those trees as mature and as healthy and as old as you could possibly get them to be able to provide all of these ecosystem services that us humans have come to depend on. So then you get into the whole messy market of ecosystem service valuation and how we're going to value certain things. And that kind of relating back to Maxime's question is, where does that start and when does that end? At what point do we start trying to put into dollar amounts the feeling of a breeze on our face or hearing birdsong in the morning when we wake up because we have a tree next to our window? So that becomes a very, very messy but fascinating debate that I would love to get in with you all, because they're really important questions to ask. And then we do have really exciting technologies that are able to help us do certain of those things. And maybe there's just a line that we need to draw there. I mean, there are certain tools already that are able to put into monetary value the air conditioning savings or the heating savings, or how much stormwater it can intercept, or how much pollution it can filter out. Those might be incredible places to start, so that we can put a dollar amount on that tree and say, well, if you invest in this technology, you can actually up that dollar amount. But until that dollar amount is taken seriously by municipalities and developers, it's going to be really difficult. And that's why, harping back on this NatureQuant example about optimizing for human health, that's why it gets really interesting for me, because then all of a sudden you have a different player. Then all of a sudden you have the field of medicine, you have public health, which are massive industries, as we've seen in the last 2 years, massive industries that are also at play. And if we can start putting, if we can start saying, well, if you cut down this and this tree, you're going to have that much more crime and this many more health issues and this many more healthcare costs, then you have a different financial player in the field that I think could be really instrumental at making sure not all of the responsibility ends up on the shoulders of developers and urban planners. Anyways, that was a much longer answer, but I think these are just really interesting things to think about. And in terms of the biosphere example, it's an interesting one. I think probably something that maybe they got wrong and that we're still getting wrong today is wanting to use technology or wanting to monitor for the sake of using technology or wanting to monitor for the sake of monitoring. And I think that when it comes down to just having almost designing your experiment or designing your site with very critical ideas in mind of, but always asking the why question. But why am I monitoring that? Why am I using this technology? So that then you become very critical about, one, if it's even needed, because I am no technologist in the sense that, I think you should always use technology to use technology. I think technology is simply a tool, and you should only use it responsibly when it's actually getting to you to that thing that you want to do. So for the case of the tree sensors, if you can prove that you're saving trees, saving money, saving man hours, saving resources, reducing CO2 emissions because you're not having as many cars and watering crews running around, then I think it's very clear that that technology is having value. If you're using that same technology to measure the amount of salinity, the amount of salt in the soil, but you're not going to use that information for that, then really what's the point? So I think that's probably something that we need to remember. And if we're ever to try and try something like that again, there are many technologies that we can use, but I think we just have to keep asking ourselves why. Why would we want to measure that?
Thanks a lot. Super interesting.
Hi, Nadina. My name is Dee. It's super interesting conversation. I can't wait to check out your podcast. So actually, I see that you're stuck a little bit. Can you hear me? Okay, great. So I work for a nonprofit organization in New York City. We support, did we? Hi.
Today? Okay, so.
Hello. I think you're muted. Can you hear us now?
Yes, I can hear you. Did you catch the end of my answer?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right, good.
Perfect.
Then I cut out at the right time.
Right. Perfect. So hi, I just want to say it's really interesting conversation. I can't wait to check out your podcast. It's really fascinating. My name is Dee. I work for a nonprofit in New York City that supports community groups, nonprofits, and small businesses with micro grants, technical assistance, and network weaving. And we work with a lot of community gardens, environmental activists. So I'm really intrigued by like the public engagement aspect of your work, especially with the tweeting tree kit. I think is a cool idea. Because we work with a lot of gardeners who are just like trying to get their garden started or like urban farming. And you kind of mentioned this equity perspective. For like, there are a lot of them who experience green space desert, like especially during the pandemic. So I'm just curious for the technology you're talking about, is there a low hanging fruit for people who have like little resources can actually tap into it and leverage this opportunity? Or is this technology still kind of new and needing more resources for only municipality or like developers to take out?
Yeah, great question, Dee. And that sounds like really exciting work. So one of the things that I started thinking about, so we've this nature score map that we've come up for the US, which is, if you're based in New York City, it's interesting to check out. You can just go to the Nature Quant website and type in any address and you can get your nature score. And one of the things that's been exciting that we've been using that for is we've just partnered with an organization called the Arbor Day Foundation, which is one of the oldest tree planting organizations in the States and in the world, actually, I'm pretty sure. And what they're basically doing is they have this massive mandate to plant 500 million trees in the next 5 years. And they're actually going to use the nature score data to prioritize which communities and which neighborhoods and which, like, on down to the street level, where they want to plant those trees. So I think that's one, because you're basically, what you're doing there is you're doing like this perfect match of the people with the resources and being able to do that, and then the people essentially with the map to be able to ensure where it goes. But an important caveat of that, of course, and there is an example that out of Detroit of this, where the municipality tried to do this really ambitious tree planting target, and in certain underserved neighborhoods in Detroit, and they did everything right. They got the trees ready. They were ready to plant, blah, blah, blah. They just forgot to ask one really important question, which was asking the people who lived in these neighborhoods if they wanted trees. And it turns out they didn't. And the project was a complete failure. So that's really important to realize, is like the data and the technology is going to get you so far, and it's never going to replace the conversations that it sounds like you get the opportunity to have on the ground, Dee, with actual organizations and people that actually live there. But do you even want these community gardens, these trees, and whatever it might be? So that's something important to remember. Another example that I'll leave you with in terms of how you can actually get involved is there was this really inspiring example out of Philadelphia. It was called Land Care. And essentially what they noticed in Philadelphia is they had a number of vacant lots. And these vacant lots that were kind of interdispersed in different, underserved residential areas. And they were kind of an area that attract a lot of crime and a lot of illegal dumping, a lot of trash, litter, and these things. And of course, it made a lot of residents in the neighborhood feel quite unsafe. So what they ended up doing is they did some research on it as well. They would go to these vacant lots and they would spend just $1,500 to clean up and green up these lots. And immediately after doing that, and they would hire also local companies to do that. So it was also a way to kind of stimulate the local economy as well. And what they found immediately, there was something insane, like it was like a 29% reduction in gun violence. But most importantly, I think also massive reductions in not only safety, but the perceived feeling of safety. So people in these neighborhoods felt a lot safer. So they end up actually, instead of being afraid of these vacant lots, they ended up using them. They put, citizens took it into their own hands. They, made their own community gardens. They added picnic tables, chairs, and what have you, to really start to use these essentially as an extension of their backyard. So I love that example because it kind of offers this way to, yes, have data, use the map to understand where to prioritize these projects, but don't forget that the map can only tell you so much, and don't forget to ask questions to people that actually live there.
Yeah, that's really great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Hey, I believe I'm the next one. I'm Gabor, an IoT engineer in Taiwan, and I want to tie back to the beginning of your presentation, the picture of where you grew up, the suburbs, and how you find people's need of separating nature from their living environment weird. And my question is that, do you think the apps that you showed us, giving small nudges and measuring nature, is it just optimizing for our broken relationship with nature that you were talking about in the opening sentences? And are there any like more like philosophical discussions of how this relationship could be changed so that we're not stuck with relying on technology to help us?
Good question. Really good question. Thank you. It is broken, but I think that's exactly why we need these technologies to kind of set us on a different path. My thinking is that right now, majority of people, I don't think, are even aware that exposure to nature is right up there with sleep, diet, exercise. I don't think people even really realize how imperative it is that not only themselves, but also their children are missing out on this experience every day, and what an impact that's having on their lives on just a very, very personal level. So being able to guide people with the tools to be able to nudge them to have more nature, I think on a wider scale, once people start taking that seriously, is also going to hopefully lead to the creation of a lot more nature in our cities where I think we need it most. So that at some point, so let me put it this way. So maybe right now, we need an app to nudge us to go into nature because we are so far removed from that. But at some point, that app becomes a bit of a game, and you start, you get your family and your friends along, and before you know it, it's like the same thing. Like before the Fitbit came out, nobody was talking about taking steps, let alone 10,000 steps. Like that's just not something that was in the mainstream. I hope we can do the same thing with Nature Dose, that at some point it becomes so normal to have your nature dose where you say to your friend, hey, yeah, we were going to go for a coffee in that cafe. Oh, but I haven't had my nature dose. So do you want to take a walk in the park instead? Whatever it might be, that it becomes so ubiquitous in just our common culture that app, in 10 or 15 or whatever it is, 20 years time, it's basically rendered itself obsolete, because we've also designed cities that you don't need to try hard to access your, have your nature dose. It's just there. In the same way that, when you have a lot of these, I don't know if you're familiar with the blue zones, it's the work of a National Geographic explorer that looks at different areas in the world where citizens tend to become 100 years or older. And he's trying to distill, these lessons from these blue zones so that we can adapt them in, a lot of different European and US cities. And one of the most confounding things that he's learned is like, well, these places are just designed, these people don't exercise, they're not like lifting weights, but their daily lifestyle means that they have to lift certain heavy things, or they have to walk up, a mountain top to get to visit their aunt, or whatever it might be. My point is that they've designed these communities. Well, they haven't designed them, these communities have been, that's led to these positive health outcomes. And I'm thinking maybe we could reverse engineer that. We need an app to get us there, but ultimately we're designing communities in a way that we don't need an app to tell us to get out in nature, because we already are.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Do you have time for one more question?
I do, if you guys do.
Oh, okay, cool. Hi, I'm Nikhil. Nice to meet you. Thank you for the presentation. I work as a sort of computer AI researcher at MIT, doing a lot of computer vision stuff applied to satellite kind of things. Really interesting talk. I really appreciate it. And one of my favorite parts about it was the bird brick things that you showed. Oh, you froze. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I don't know if she can hear me though.
Ah, okay. Nadina, are you still with us? Mhm.
I guess you didn't want to hear my question.
Nice strategy.
Seriously, just leave when people are asking.
Sorry. Sorry, I'm back. I'm sorry,
Oh,
the
no.
connection dropped again.
No.
I'd
Thanks
love to hear your question.
just giving you a hard time. Yeah, so one of the things that I most enjoyed about your presentation, or one of the little tidbits, was this bird brick thing, with this idea of building the things such that there is a very harmonious integration between technology and nature. I appreciate that very much. One of the interesting things, I work mainly on the technical side, and one of the interesting things I've seen about the technical side is that there's a very, there's almost a planned obsolescence in the way we build things. Things don't get better over time. One of the many marvelous things about nature is everything gets better over time. It integrates with its environment in a very beautiful way. And so I'm curious, sort of, what would it mean for something to get, like AI kind of offers this promise in some way? You know, you add more data, the model becomes more refined, and things get better over time. But I'm curious, like, what does that actually mean? Like, what would it look like for a technology to get better? Like the sensor thing, I'll give you an example. Those are going to break someday, and they're going to pollute the environment, and there's going to introduce contaminants to the soil. They're going to do all these kinds of things. But I'm curious, what would it look like if they were to grow together, and how would that sort of, you know, I guess you're Dutch, so I'll throw a Dutch philosopher at you. Spinoza had this idea of God and nature being one, right? And I'm curious, what would technology look like in a harmonious integration in that sort of way? Very vague question, but I'm curious thoughts.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. One, I'll just have a quick caveat, is that I am fervently against any like low-cost sensor that doesn't have a plan. I mean, there's a lot in the smart city movement, you know, planning. It's like, you know, why are we monitoring it? I think if you're just monitoring it, you end up putting sensors on everything and nobody cares about them, and they end up just becoming waste. So that's something that I am very much against. And I think it's also important in the sensor design, make sure it's modular, make sure you can, you know, swap out parts and stuff so that it is robust. You could take it out, you can move in it, blah, blah, blah. So that is something important to keep in mind. But on a more philosophical note, what would that look like? There is one actually sensor company that, like, I feel like is kind of taking it a step further. They're called Plant E from the Netherlands, based out of Wageningen. Some of you may already heard about them, but essentially what they do is they started creating, essentially they create electricity out of plants. So they're able to use, and I'm no expert here on how it works, but essentially they are able to generate electricity based on plants. And this was cool, right? But then the question was kind of like, okay, but like, why would you need that? Okay, I guess you could have, you know, your lights in your garden, you know, and not have to use like a solar, or not have to have a cable. So it kind of had these little gimmicky use cases, until they came up with a soil moisture sensor of their own, which essentially is able to power itself because you have no need for batteries. And then when you hook that up to an irrigation system, which is then hooked up to the cloud, the digital one, not the one with the actual precipitation. And you could actually have like a fully kind of like hands-free situation where the sensor, which is powered by the plants, is also providing information on how that plant is doing, so that an action can be taken to ensure that that plant gets the extra, you know, whether it's nourishment or water that it needs, and then can then feed back that information to the cloud, so that the human can sit back and be like, I have to do nothing, like hands-free. That maybe that's something, you know, if we could add into that sensor and that irrigation system at some point in, like, you know, 30 years down the line, completely disintegrates and completely biodegrades, then maybe we've got our answer to what that might look like. But for now, it is fun to brainstorm about. But yeah, that's definitely something that came top of mind immediately when you said that.
Yeah, that's super cool. Thanks, appreciate it.
Of course.
I think we are good. Thanks a lot, really, Nadina, for this super insightful presentation, for taking the time to answer all the questions. I also have several questions in mind, related to your previous lectures like low tech, indigenous urbanism, but I know that you have to go. So thanks a lot, Nadina. For those of you who want to stay in the room to discuss this lecture, you are more than welcome. And for the, do you have a question or is it? Okay, sorry. And yes, you can obviously. And for the rest of you, the other lecture will be next week. It will be about circular cities with Tamara Strickland, that you know very well, Nadina. And we will also have a collective intelligence session Friday with Naila about meaningful inefficiencies.
Thanks for having me. Bye, guys. Good luck.
No, thanks.